So this marks the beginning of my commentary and reflection on the Platonic dialogue Parmenides. So I have yet to read anything into this other than the introduction by the translator. And usually I don't do this, but I think that I ought to start doing it. I'd like to read it. It's a bit lengthy. Maybe not lengthy, but at least for our purposes, perhaps it's a bit lengthy. It's about a page and a half. So I'll read this, won't spend any particular time thinking about it or reflecting on it, and then move right into the dialogue. As far as I can tell, the structure of this dialogue is going to be a bit different. It is not as clear exactly who is speaking in terms of annotation. It's more open. But nonetheless, the dialogue Parmenides. So I'd like to open this with a bit of a prayer. So, dear Lord, I thank you for this day, and I thank you that we can be here. I thank you for challenges. I thank you for this challenge that we're about to embark on. I thank you for the challenges of the day today. It happens to be a Monday. It happens to be a holiday week. And so there's a lot of festivities about. And for all that we experience, I'm thankful for those moments and those long-standing points of order that we are able to experience, such as love, thankfulness, forgiveness, grace, mercy, truthfulness, understanding, discipline. All of this I keep in mind as we approach this dialogue and as we wind down the day, as it is the evening. And with this I pray, in Jesus' name, amen. Okay, so nonetheless, here we go with the introduction. The great philosopher Parmenides is the central figure of this dialogue. He, not Socrates, directs the philosophical discussion. If Plato has spoken here, it is Parmenides. Socrates is portrayed as a very bright and promising young philosopher. He is virtually a teenager, only just beginning his career in the subject, who needs to think a lot harder and longer before he will have an adequate grasp of the nature of reality. This Socrates is a budding metaphysician, not the purely ethical thinker of apology and other Socratic dialogues. Accompanied by his disciple, Zeno, originator of Zeno's paradoxes, Parmenides has come on a visit to Athens. At Pythagoras, his house, after Zeno has read out his book, now lost, attacking the intelligibility of any plurality of real things, Socrates questions Zeno, and is then questioned by Parmenides about his own conception of reality as consisting of non-physical, non-perceptible forms in which perceptible physical entities participate. Parmenides raises 6 difficulties that Socrates' view entails, including the celebrated third man argument, to which 20th century analytical philosophers have paid much attention. Concluding the first part of the dialogue, he explains the method of analysis which Socrates must now use in order to resolve them. Socrates' efforts to articulate a theory of forms have been premature. One must consider systematically not just the consequences of any hypothesis, but also those of its denial, and the method involves other complexities as well. One must systematically consider 8 different trains of consequences in order to decide fully what the right way of putting one's thesis will be. In the second part of the dialogue, occupying more than 2/3 of its total length, Parmenides demonstrates this new method, using as his respondent not Socrates, but one of the other young men present, Aristotle. In choosing this name, Plato may have been alluding to the philosopher Aristotle, who began his own metaphysical work as a member of Plato's academy. Considering the hypothesis of one being, he works out a series of 8 conflicting deductions, plus a 9th, added as an appendix to the first 2. As to its metaphysically significant properties, its being, unity, sameness, and difference, similarity and dissimilarity, motion and rest, place, time, and so on. It is left to Socrates and to the reader to infer just what use to make of these deductions in determining how best to formulate an adequate theory of forms, since the theory that Socrates presented at the beginning of the dialogue is plainly one developed in Symposium, Phaedo, and Republic. This dialogue seems to be implying that the theory of forms needs refurbishing, and that in demonstrating this method, or his method, Parmenides has shown us how to do that. Parmenides thus points forward to sophist, statesman, and Philebus, where forms are further rethought. The meeting of Socrates with the Eleatic philosophers, an invention of Plato's, is reported in a way unparalleled in other dialogues. The narrator, Cephalus, a different Cephalus from the one whose house the Republic's conversations takes place, speaks directly to the reader, as Socrates himself does in the Republic, telling of his visit to Athens from his home in Clazomene, accompanied by a group of Clazomenian philosophers. Clazomene was famous as the birthplace of the pre-Socratic physical philosopher Anaxagoras. They have come especially to hear Antiphon, in fact Plato's younger half-brother, recite from memory the record of this conversation. He had heard it from Pythagoras. Cephalus now reports what Antiphon said, and himself reporting what Pythagoras had told him the various speakers on the original occasion had said to one another. 4 levels of conversation, counting the one Cephalus is having now with an undetermined group, us, the readers. The effect is twofold: to emphasize the extraordinary philosophical value of this conversation, and to put us hearers at a great intellectual distance from it, as if to say that we could barely be expected to assimilate and learn properly from it. The situation in Symposium is in some ways comparable, except that the meeting there is reported at only 2 removes, and its frame apparently extends only to those with a personal interest in Socrates. One intimate of Socrates has just reported to it a second, and is now reporting it to another friend. This conversation is marked as having truly universal significance. Okay, so with that is the introduction by the translator. Or maybe I should say the author, I'm not really sure, because there's a footnote here that says translated by Mary Louise Gill and Paul Ryan, so I'm not really sure. But in any case, so we begin with Cephalus's opening. So usually how this has gone is that I've read 2 pages and then gone back and reflected and interpreted, because otherwise it gets too dense too quickly and I don't retain the information. And so reading it once and then going back over it again to really attack the important information has been a productive experience. Not perfect, of course, and perhaps tedious, but it's been useful. So I plan to do the same thing here. Now the first couple pages are probably going to be a bit introductory before we get into any strong, meaty philosophical territory, but nonetheless, here we go. When we arrived in Athens from the home of Clazomene, we ran into Adeimantus and Glaucon in the marketplace. Adeimantus took me by the hand and said, "Welcome, Cephalus. If there is anything you want to hear that we can do for you, please tell us." In fact, That's the very reason I'm here, I replied. To ask a favor of you. Tell us what you want, he said. And I replied, your half-brother on your mother's side. What was his name? I've forgotten. He would have been a child when I came here from Clazemene to stay before, and that's a long time ago now. I think his father's name was Perlampes. It was, indeed, he said. And his? Antiphon. But why do you ask? These men are fellow citizens of mine, I said, keen philosophers, and they have heard that this Antiphon met many times with a friend of Zeno's, called Pythagoras, and can recite from memory the discussions that Socrates and Zeno and Parmenides had once had, since he heard it often from Pythagoras. That's true, he said. Well, we want to hear the discussion, I replied. Nothing hard about that, he said. When Antiphon was a young man, he practiced it to perfection, although these days, just like the grandfather he's named for, he devotes most of his time to horses. But that's what's called for. Let's go to his house. He left here to go home just a short time ago, but he lives close to Melite. After this exchange, we set off walking and found Antiphon at home, engaged a smith to work on a bit of some kind. When he had finished with the smith, and his brothers told him why we were there, he recognized me from my earlier visit and greeted me. We asked him to go through the discussion, and he balked at first. It was, he said, a lot of work, but finally he narrated it in detail. Antiphon said that Pythagoras said that Zeno and Parmenides once came to the great Panathenea. Parmenides was already quite venerable, very gray, but of distinguished appearance, about 65 years old. Zeno was at that time close to 40, a tall, handsome man who had been, as rumor had it, the object of Parmenides' affections when he was a boy. Antiphon said that the two of them were staying with Pythagoras outside the city wall in the potter's quarter, and that Socrates had come there, along with a number of others, because they were eager to hear Zeno read his book, which he and Parmenides had just brought to Athens for the first time. Socrates was then quite young. Zeno was reading to them in person. Parmenides happened to be out. Very little remained to be read when Pythagoras, as he related it, came in, and with him Parmenides and Aristotle, the man who later became one of 30. They listened a little to the book at the very end, but not Pythagoras himself. He had heard Zeno read it before. Then Socrates, after he had heard it, asked Zeno to read the first hypothesis of the first argument again. And when he read it, Socrates said, Zeno, what do you mean by this? If things are many, they must then be both like and unlike. But that is impossible, because unlike things can't be like, or like things unlike. That's what you say, isn't it? So before we move on, I want to give some historical context or potential historical context. In the introduction, the author noted that this Aristotle figure was potentially one that studied under Plato. That was the famous Aristotle, the philosopher. But I've gone to ChatGPT, and we'll have to take this with a grain of salt, but I'll read what it says here. It says, who is Aristotle, the man who later became one of the 30? This Aristotle is not the Aristotle the philosopher. He is a different historical figure. Aristotle of Athens, Aristoteles, son of Timocrates. He later became one of the 30 tyrants, the oligarchic council installed in Athens at the end of the Peloponnesian War in 404 BCE, responsible for a violent and oppressive regime. Who were the 30 tyrants? After Athens lost the Peloponnesian War, Sparta imposed a narrow oligarchic regime composed of 30 appointed rulers, known as the 30. This regime suspended democratic institutions, executed citizens without trial, confiscated property, exiled opponents, and generally terrorized the city. The 30 tyrants were led by Critias, Plato's relative, Charicles, and Parmenides, later killed by the others. Aristotle, this one, was a member of that regime. So to continue, "It is," said Zeno, "if it's impossible for unlike things to be like, and like things unlike, isn't it then also impossible for them to be many? Because, if they were many, they would have incompatible properties. Is this the point of your argument? Simply to maintain, in opposition to everything that is commonly said, that things are not many? And do you suppose that each of your arguments is proof for this position, so that you think you give as many proofs that things are not many as your book has arguments? Is that what you're saying, or do I misunderstand?" "No," Zeno replied. "On the contrary, you grasp the general point of the book splendidly." "Parmenides," Socrates said, "I understand that Zeno wants to be on intimate terms with you, not only in friendship, but also in his book. He has, in a way, written the same thing as you, but by changing it round he tries to fool us into thinking he is saying something different. You say in your poem that all is one, and you have given splendid and excellent proofs for that. He, for his part, says that it is not many, and gives a vast array of very grand proofs of his own. So, with one of you saying one, and the other not many, and with each of you speaking in a way that suggests that you've said nothing the same, although you mean practically the same thing, what you've said you appear to have said over the heads of the rest of us." "Yes, Socrates," said Zeno. "Still, you haven't completely discerned the truth about my book, even though you chase down its arguments and follow their spoor as keenly as a young Spartan hound. First of all, you have missed this point. The book doesn't at all preen itself on having been written with the interest you described, while distinguishing it from people as if that were some great accomplishment. You have mentioned something that happened accidentally. The truth is that the book comes to the defense of Parmenides, argument against those who try to make fun of it by claiming that, if it is one, many absurdities and self-contradictions result from that argument. Accordingly, my book speaks against those who assert the many and pays them back in kind with something for good measure, since it aims to make clear that their hypothesis, if it is many, would, if someone examined the matter thoroughly, suffer consequences even more absurd than those suffered by the hypothesis of its being one. In that competitive spirit, then, I wrote the book when I was a young man. Someone made an unauthorized copy, so I didn't even have the chance to decide for myself whether or not it should see the light. So in this respect you've missed the point, Socrates. You think it was written not out of a young man's competitiveness, but out of a mature man's vainglory. Still, as I said, your betrayal was not bad." "I take your point," Socrates said, "and I believe it was as you say. But tell me this. Don't you acknowledge that there is a form itself, by itself, of likeness, and another form, opposite to this, which is what unlike is? Don't you and I, and the other things we call many, get a share of those two identities? And don't things that get a share of likeness come to be like in that way and to the extent that they get a share, whereas things that get a share of unlikeness come to be unlike, and things that get a share of both come to be both? And even if all things get a share of both, though they are opposites, and by partaking of them are both like and unlike themselves, what's astonishing about that? If someone showed that the likes themselves come to be unlike, or unlikes like, that, I think, would be a marvel. But if he shows that things that partake of both of these have both properties, there seems to me nothing strange about that, Zeno. Not even if someone shows that all things are one by partaking of oneness, and that these same things are many by partaking also of multitude. But if he should demonstrate this thing itself, what one is, to be many, or conversely, the many to be one, at this I'll be astonished. And it's the same with all the others. If he could show that the kinds of forms themselves have in themselves these opposite properties, that would call for astonishment. But if someone should demonstrate that I am one thing and many, what's astonishing about that? He will say, when he wants to show that I am many, that my right side is different from my left, and my front from my back, and likewise with my upper and lower parts. Since I take it, I do partake of multitude. But when he wants to show that I am one, he will say that I am one person among the seven of us, because I partake of oneness. Thus he shows that both are true. So if, in the case of stones and sticks and such things, someone tries to show that the same thing is many and one, we'll say that he is demonstrating something to be many and one, not that the one to be many or the many one. And we'll say that he is saying nothing astonishing, but just what all of us would agree to. But if someone first distinguishes as separate the forms themselves by themselves of the things that I was talking about a moment ago, for example, likeness and unlikeness, multitude and oneness, rest and motion, and everything of that sort, and then shows that in themselves they can mix together and separate, I, for my part, he said, would be utterly amazed. Zeno, I think these issues have been handled with great vigor in your book, but I would, as I say, be much more impressed if someone were able to display this same difficulty which you and Parmenides went through in the case of visible things, also similarly entwined in multifarious ways in the forms themselves, and things that are grasped by reasoning. So I can already tell that this is going to be a dense dialogue, partly because this builds on previous information that we have had in particularly the Sophist. Now I say that because this exact point was brought up earlier, in the sense that when Parmenides says all is one, there is a rebuttal in the Sophist by the Eleatic visitor. And there's this long, drawn-out process through which we deny that statement. But at the end of it, it became something of a transformation rather than a denial. And the denial, as it were, had to do with the rejection of a rigid unity. And what we came to was more of a preference for a dynamic unity, one that included difference. So The redefinition of not being as difference. When we say A is not B, we are not invoking non-existence, but stating that A is other than B. Once difference is reintroduced, the whole world becomes thinkable again. Motion, rest, plurality, forms, true and false speech. Being itself is revealed as a fabric woven from the greatest kinds. Being, same, different, motion, and rest. So we have a unity, a rather complex unity, a part of a woven fabric. And it's interesting that Socrates gets into this dilemma, it would seem, between the plurality of being and the centrality of being. And I think it is this question that often lies at the center between those that believe in God and those that believe in something else, more multiplicitous. It could be many gods, again, polytheism, or sort of an atomistic religion, a religion of principle, perhaps, these fundamental kinds. We have a pluralism that exists within Plato, but also a unity, so it's going to be difficult to understand exactly how these are reconciled. And we know how they're reconciled in the Sophist, but all the same, the question comes back again, seemingly with new vigor. So Socrates brings in, for the first time in this dialogue, the form. He says, don't you acknowledge that there is a form itself by itself? Now let's try our best to define what this form might be. Now, using form in basic colloquial language, it is something that has a shape. It is something that has substance, usually. It is something that has qualities, usually many qualities. In this Platonic sense, of course, I've already been exposed to this, so the analogy goes farther into the realm of ideas, concepts, the perfection among things. Where I may see in front of me something that is circular, but it is not the form of the circle. It participates in that form, where the form is this idealized version of the thing that is. And so now when Socrates is saying there is a form itself by itself, I think we can easily say that there is a form of being, that is fundamentally being. And this is cause, I think, for unification and moving away from multiplicity and pluralism. Now, we move directly into a pluralistic landscape in which he brings in two ideas, two forms, likeness and unlike. In typical Socrates fashion, he's using the opposites. Now, much like in the Proverbs, thinking about things at this scale, it should be easier than it is. We see the word like. In most instances throughout our lives, we are not pausing for any significant degree to think about exactly what it means. We sort of have this intuitive understanding of what it is. But it's not until we begin to think about the nuts and bolts of what this means that it becomes difficult. And surely many things are difficult if they don't have proper grounding or proper contextual relevance. And so thinking about like and unlike in this situation, I feel like I have to ask, well, like what? Unlike what? And surely all things are come to understanding and knowing by their relations. Not, again, that they're relative, but because perspective, but also the building of that network of interrelatedness is the thing that exposes the broader structure of the thing that is. And if we are thinking about a layered ontology that participates in unity, so we don't get lost in pluralism, this is sort of the thing that we reflect on in all of conscious experience of man and of perhaps the divine finds itself in this network. That grand divine and unification is sort of what I'm interested in reflecting on. But going back to this idea of like and unlike, it would seem at the beginning of that which we consider to be like, we start with a point of attention. I can't speak so much to the form of like and unlike at the present moment, but just as far as I can see something that is, we have made our first step into that territory of what is like and what is unlike. Immediately, what becomes clear on observation about any particular thing at all is that there is a graduated structure, a graduated layering. For I can say that one thing is completely dissimilar to another thing, and yet always, if a thing is to be, then they share in likeness, because they share in being at the very least. Now I happen to be looking down at my table. There happens to be two pieces of wood that are screwed together. In this wood, there is the wood grain. And the structure, the pattern that is made up by the wood grain, is different on one side of the partition versus the other. And insofar as they are different, they share in a quality of being unlike. But they are like in other respects, in terms of their color, in terms of their material composition, in terms of its purpose. Now there's a language that is used by Socrates. He says, "Don't you and I and the other things we call many get a share of those two entities?" Now, let's think for a moment, because the form becomes immediately clear once we build it off of some focal point of attention. The form is necessary to hold the concept of like and unlike. The material structure is not the thing that holds it, per se, but it's the thing that is necessary, I suppose, to be the environment or the soil through which the form is realized. It's embodied in a way. Now, of the form up in this space, I think back to what we considered before about that potential for, or rather I should say the idea that all things that are have, at least in part of their being, dependent on its relationship to other things that are. And I've mentioned, as the visitor has said, when we've done our reading and reflection on the Sophist, in rebuttal to Parmenides, that in all things are one, there's an additive clause that's necessary. And I won't get into that again, but the point being is that if we reduce somehow being to a singular identity, then it collapses in on itself, just as much as it would collapse in on itself if everything was non-being, because non-being needs being in order for it to be something. It's a differentiator, not absence. Even if we chose to say absence, then of course that thing, or no thing, would collapse in on itself because there is no thing there. In fact, there's nothing to collapse. It would just be nothing. And it's by the principled nature of being that sort of constantly transforms. There's a birth cycle, a death cycle. There is a maturation. Perhaps there's a regression, a progression. All of these changing states require interrelated relationships, some affording, some detracting, some mutually benefiting. All of these, though, are contributing to the broader thing that we can say is a singular identity. Now, I bring this back up because of likeness. In the sense that likeness and unlikeness are two terms that seemingly require two forms of being. It's a sort of a transjective term, and their forms, I'll say, occupy that transjective landscape. And so when we're thinking about a particular way in which likeness and unlikeness is expressed, it is expressed within these links. The links being between aspects of being, or between separate identities, let's say. Now, I suppose we can also extend this to the self. It doesn't have to just be related to a plurality of things, and it also doesn't have to be related to a duality of things. It can be related to one thing, and this could be experiences of behavior. It could be the uncertainty of self when it does something, and the foreign nature of something that has been acted, or, let's say acted, performed, how it is inconsistent with identity, and how that aspect of unlikeness through that transjective landscape can be realized and understood. Now, Socrates says, don't you and I and the other things we call many get a share of those two identities? So there's the implication that out of all of the things, there is a relationship between likeness and unlikeness. Just as we said, it is likely that this is the case because it rests within the in-between, the comparison. He continues, and don't things that get a share of likeness come to be like in that way and to extend that they get a share, whereas things that get a share of unlikeness come to be unlike, and things that get a share of both come to be both. So this can be quick to unravel. So I want to follow this slowly and closely. I think it's quite understandable, readily understandable for myself, that likeness and unlikeness are these forms, these concepts that transcend what we would consider an embodied or materialized expression. And it's when we find ourselves thinking about these things, like the two sides of my table here, that are two different pieces of wood, then we can see how they participate in these forms. And again, as Socrates says, both in terms of how they are alike and how they participate in the form of unlikeness. And there's really nothing, as he says, astonishing about either of these three identifications. Now, the first conundrum is, he says, if someone showed that the likes themselves come to be unlike, or the unlikes like, that, I think, would be a marvel. So do we understand, or do we know there to be an example in nature where this is the case? I think there are certain species of fish with a sexual ambiguity, or rather, that at a certain stage of life they begin as one sex and then they transition to another, and their responsibilities change. So that is an interesting thing. But thinking about the table for a moment, to stay with a consistent analogy, can we find ourselves of the opinion that the qualities that are like and the qualities that are unlike can somehow change? At the foundational level, it doesn't seem to be the case. Now, I can make some difference to the structure of this wood, or the surface of the wood. I could put equal carvings, or I could put different carvings on each side, and that would add to the characteristics. But it is not like I'm taking something fundamental and moving it or changing it into something else. Even the color, I can say, well, I can paint one side white and keep the other side the same, which is brown. In that case, would we have something that was like now become unlike? I suppose so. In this way, it requires a third party, but it is possible by that way. But I think the point that Socrates is trying to make here is not so much the specifics that can be changed. It is of the things that are, is it possible that of the brownness that they share in, that somehow there's a likeness to it and an unlikeness to it? It takes its share from likeness, and it does not seem to take a dissimilarity at all. Now, we can say that there are different degrees to which we can characterize this brownness, especially as it comes to the specific wood grain structure. There is a subtle differences in color when it comes to moving up and down the peaks and valleys of the grains in the wood. But even here, this is a moot point. This is secondary. It's not really the principle of the matter. The brownness that they share that likeness in is constant, unless it's, of course, changed by some outside actor. And so by that snapshot, there's nothing I think we can say of participating in both. Now, Socrates extends this analogy out, and he says, it's not just the form of likeness and unlikeness, but it's also that of oneness and many, which is, in my opinion, a much more sophisticated topic. It's a broader topic, perhaps. And these two pieces of the table serve us well, because there are technically three pieces of the tabletop, but two that I'm looking at right here. And we could say that, well, there are obviously two that are different. I can take apart this table right now and clearly identify the two parts. And I can merge them as they are merged now with various screws and so forth. And I can say that it is one. It participates in the table. The paradox, it would seem, if we can call it a paradox, is if we take the table, which is the singular, it is the one that all of the parts participate in. If we were to somehow call that many, would it be possible? Or does it necessarily at some point just transition and flip into many? That when we begin to describe how it is many, it's because we're describing its parts, and that gets its share in unlikeness, all of the individual identities that exist to make up the table. Now we have to remember that the initial assertion is that all is one. And the problem that we are coming to is that our conception of the forms so far in this dialogue is preventing us from getting there. And that's because it would seem that when we are purely in the formal territory, let's say for likeness, unlikeness, or oneness, and multitude, or many, or plurality, once we try to reconcile and say that the many is actually one, without taking share of the form of oneness, then we run into issues. And if we run into an issue here, then we can say, well, how is it possible that all things participate in one singular purpose, a thread that runs through them all, without having some contradiction in our hypothesis? And a good sentence for which Socrates lays this out, he says, so if, in the case of stones and sticks and such things, someone tries to show that the same thing is many and one, we'll say that he is demonstrating something to be many and one, not the one to be many or the many one, and we'll say that he is saying nothing astonishing, but just what all of us would agree to. So again, he's making this distinction between making a principled change in the form and contrasting this between making a change in embodiment, essentially. That is, of a thing that, relative to other things, has parts to it that participates in multitude but also participates in oneness. That the thing itself, because it pulls from both, it allows for that dynamism. Whereas what we are concerned with is in the formal domain, since we're not really talking about the forms that are pulling from something, but rather are for the sake of themselves. Again, when Socrates says, I take your point, and I believe it was as you say, but tell me this, don't you acknowledge that there is a form itself by itself of likeness, and another form opposite to this, which is what unlikeness is? So if we are to maintain the hypothesis that all is one, then we cannot necessarily continue in the path that we have so far. So either all is one is false, or the hypothesis of the forms as Socrates has laid it out is false. And that it is possible for the form of oneness somehow to be reconciled with difference and unlikeness into oneness. So I think the next thing to do would be to imagine the mixing of these forms. And here it's hard because within the framework that we are being introduced to, there's a separation between the formal landscape and the landscape of the subject. Because if I want to use examples from experience, I don't think I'd be able to do that, because I am not a form. I am not the human being. I'm a human being. Of course, I can conceptualize and think about these things. So let's think a little bit more maybe about the fundamentals, even if we don't get to any particular area that relates to the mixing of the forms. For the forms is an interesting concept, something that I think is useful psychologically. It's useful in the sense that we can see something for what it is, more purely, separating things out compartmentally rather than having some mixed identity being our guiding, or rather our, well, maybe we could say guiding, but attentive focal point. When we are trying to solve problems, I think we pull strongly from forms that are unmixed. We may, and surely we always do, maybe not always, but surely we do often, end up mixing things in the end. But the formal landscape, the landscape of purity, as something is useful conceptually. And I think that there are all sorts of varying degrees by which we do this subjectively. That we may not necessarily think about the form of the table very often, even though I think that's probably inaccurate. I think we do, especially if we're trying to build one or trying to identify if something is a table. We have all of these different experiences of what a table is, but ultimately I think that there is a purpose that underlies what the table ultimately represents. And that formal structure, although there is some mixing in terms of how a table can manifest and how it may look, if it doesn't meet certain criteria, then it cannot be a table. Now, conceptualizing the forms does not seem to be an easy task. There always seems to be something that is added to the definition, or some experience by which it reveals some new insight about the nature of these things. But again, to reiterate, the forms have an aspect of purity to them, that they are for the sake of what is, whether that be, as Socrates mentions, oneness, rest, motion, multitude, likeness, unlikeness. In order to understand them and see them clearly, it is useful to have this landscape for which they are defined for their own purposes, what they are responsible for. And again, their mixing gives us a certain level of dynamism in our experience. But if we move up beyond our experience, and we say, okay, there is this landscape, however we may picture it, for which the concepts of purity exist. And if all things are going to participate in oneness, how is it that the concepts themselves of purity, regardless of whether or not we have some unseen or hidden landscape for which there is as the human mind might want to conceptualize it, as some alien race or a bunch of divine figures that represent humanoid characters maneuvering things in that sphere, it may or may not be useful to think in that way. For our purposes now, I think it's rather not useful to think in that way. I do think it is useful to consider, however, that these aspects of purity are elements of our experience. And I don't think it would be trivial to say that they are a product of the human mind and likely exist independent of the human mind, as all things have this participation and mixture, but above them, in terms of the form that they participate in and the purposes that they serve, these have a transcendent and divine quality, it would seem, to them. And by this divine quality, I like to say that this realm, the space that we are considering, is the realm of intelligibility. It is not a realm of things. It is not a realm that gets caught up in mixture, that participates in both likeness and unlikeness, or oneness and multitude, like each one of us does. What I see is a field of principles. It is it's quite easy to speak in spatial temporal language. So I say field. When I think of mind, I think of something that is tapping into being itself. And it does that with a particular grammar. And I think intelligibility and the sight of the conscious experience provides that grammar. Now, what do we say about grammar in terms of language? There can be correct grammar and incorrect grammar. I would say correct grammar is the sentence structures that afford coherent thought in language, in written language. I think the same is true for the realm of intelligibility, that the grammar of being must be consistent to actually have some purposeful articulation of mind. And here I think about this contrast between the productive mind that is able to use a productive field of principles and system of causes, and a mind that is diseased or pathological. And I think of schizophrenia in this situation. And I think of the true way in which it's pathological. Not in the way that they are participating in some land of intelligibility that perhaps is true. They're playing with building blocks. But the building blocks doesn't cohere to the intermixing of the formal domain that they are participating at their level of experience or existence. So if we are to say that the realm of intelligibility is to be the structure according to which reality is intelligible, if we build a strong structure to improve the intelligibility of reality, then this is the basis for education. This is the basis of the productive mind, the expansion, the healthy expansion of the self, of the mind. So moving forward, I think one of the things that we have to keep in mind, especially understanding that the introduction tells us that we are going to be introduced to a system of thinking about things, and in the process of that systemic introduction, we are going to be poking holes at Socrates' argument of the forms. Now, we've been exposed to more sophisticated types here, but I think this experience is going to be something that causes us require us to revisit some of the earlier dialogues in order to approach it with new eyes. But what I wanted to say is that we have to move away from this spatial temporal thinking if we are to be thinking about the realm of forms appropriately. That the form and the mixed structure, or the structure that is within the reality of our experience, they relate through intelligibility and not through location or by some other measure of that way. We can say that they relate through the mind's ability to recognize being. Now, Socrates goes on to say, I would, as I say, be much more impressed if someone were able to display the same difficulty which you and Parmenides went through in the case of visible things, also similarly entwined in multifarious ways in the forms themselves, in things that are grasped by reasoning. And I think this is a good place because when we struggle with that problem, we are struggling with the problem of the level of experience in existence at the level of physical perception. This is more of the material type of awareness, that we use our vision and we see material causes before us. But we don't necessarily do this in conjunction I'll say this. We don't necessarily do this in strong conjunction with the forms, but he's saying that when they went through this problem, that being Parmenides and Zeno, they recognized that there is a intertwined and multivarious way in which they participate with the forms. And this, I think, would be fascinating. So I'm just going to read the rest of this page. And I want to see if this works better than reading 2 pages. Pythagoras said that, while Socrates was saying all this, he kept himself from moment to moment expecting Parmenides and Zeno to get annoyed. But they both paid close attention to Socrates and often glanced at each other and smiled, as though they admired him. In fact, what Parmenides said when Socrates had finished confirmed this impression. Socrates, he said, you are much to be admired for your keenness for argument. Tell me, have you yourself distinguished as separate, in the way you mentioned, certain forms themselves, and also as separate the things that partake of them? And do you think that likeness itself is something separate from the likeness we have? And one and many, and all the things you heard Zeno read about a while ago. I do indeed, Socrates answered. And what about these? Asked Parmenides. Is there a form itself by itself of just and beautiful and good and everything of that sort? Yes, he said. What about a form of human being, separate from us, and all those like us? Is there a form itself of human being, or fire, or water? Socrates said, Parmenides, I have often found myself in doubt whether I should talk about those in the same way as the others, or differently. And what about these, Socrates? Things that might seem absurd, like hair and mud and dirt, or anything else totally undignified and worthless. Are you doubtful whether or not you should say that a form is separate for each of these two, which in turn is other than anything we touch with our hands? Not at all, Socrates said. On the contrary, these things are in fact just what we see. Surely it's too outlandish to think there is a form for them. Not that the thought that the same thing might hold in all cases hasn't troubled me from time to time. Then, when I get bogged down in that, I hurry away, afraid that I may fall into some pit of nonsense and come to harm. But when I arrive back at the vicinity of the things we agreed a moment ago have forms, I linger there and occupy myself with them. That's because you are still young, Socrates, said Parmenides, and philosophy has not yet gripped you as, in my opinion, it will in the future, once you begin to consider none of these cases beneath your notice. Now, though, you still care about what people think, because of your youth. But tell me this. Is it your view that, as you say, there are certain forms from which these other things get by share of them, derive their names, as, for instance, they come to be like by getting a share of likeness, large by getting a share of largeness, and just and beautiful by getting a share of justice and beauty? It certainly is, Socrates replied. So one thing perhaps that's important to reiterate is the relationship that Socrates has to Zeno and Parmenides. He's very much a junior. However, despite being a junior, he is recognized and seen as somebody who has a lot of potential and probably already has a very strong grasp on this type of discussion, such that they can appreciate it, but they also see his youth, which means that they see perhaps some holes in his arguments, or perhaps of his methods. And so this is going to be interesting not only to see how Socrates responds to this and grows into it, but as he goes and grows into it, as will we. So I think we sort of have to go into that with that understanding and mindset. And here comes the important question. Have you yourself distinguished as separate, in the way you mention, certain forms from themselves, and also as separate the things that partake of them? And I think one can easily conclude, in fact we did, that Socrates' earlier expressions leads one into a territory for which we have to at least consider separation. And at this point, maybe not enough was described, but I think there's enough hinted at the very least, to know that if one is to take the forms to the next level, a more detailed discussion about how the forms as they are in the intelligible sphere and perhaps everything else that draws from that intelligible sphere, which includes all of material reality. The relationship among these two pieces would be one integral step in coming into harmony with Parmenides' thesis that all is one. But also the exercise would give us a greater insight into the intelligible world. We are embodied beings, of course we experience a little bit of both, but as coming from somebody who is more materially minded, from a materially minded culture, the utility of the intelligible sphere and everything that has to offer ought to be that much more expansive to our own psychology, let's say. Now the next question, what's interesting here is that the next question is not just another question, but it is related and also at a level or layer more specific. So we start by the recognition and a wondering about the difference between the intelligible sphere, minded sphere, sphere of being and purpose, and that of the material sphere, and how it relates. But given that they have been mentioned distinctly, there is a question mark there. And we go more specifically, and we take a specific form, which is likeness, and they say, recognizing likeness as a form and what's beneath it, that those that participate in it. So Parmenides is recognizing that he himself, under Socrates' description, participates in likeness. And he wonders now if what he participates with is that thing different from the form that he participates in, which is altogether interesting, because if it's the same, then what do we say about the form and its participation in this mixture? Because we are not all just pure likeness. There's difference all about us, and between us and all of this. And he gets yet seemingly less specific, but also more specific at the same time, specific in the principled sense that he's focusing on a particular, the one and the many. This is the central question, it would seem. Are all things one or not? And oneness and multiplicity are surely bigger categories than that of likeness. But it's almost like we went down into this little cavern and now we're coming back up into something again that is a big orienting type question. So we have these three big questions. To this, Socrates says, I do, indeed. It's almost like one of these text messages that we might get from our friends, or an email that only responds to a certain selection, and we're left wondering, well, okay, is it all the questions? Is it, what do you think about all of these other things? And so he's asked, what about these? Says Parmenides, is there a form itself by itself of just and beautiful and good and everything of that sort? Now to this, Socrates says yes. So what have we learned in this short little instance? Well, it's not just that he names particular forms, particular intelligibilities, but these, it seems to me at least, are baskets. Baskets of organized information, meaningful information. And I say that because what is just, what is beautiful, what is good has a certain movement to it, has a certain direction to it, has a certain purpose to it. And to this, Socrates says yes. Of the things that are mentioned, at least, deserve the title of having or being a form or a form of these things. I think the next question is, well, how far do we carry this? Is there a form of every particular thing? Is it only generally broad things? Is this an arbitrary distinction? Parmenides says, what about a form of human being separate from us, and like those like us, and all those like us? Is there a form itself of human being, or fire, or water? To this, Socrates responds, I've often found myself in doubt whether I should talk about those in the same way as the others or differently. Now we have to ask, why is this the case? We could say on one hand that these are not as lofty concepts as the former. The human being participates in all of this goodness, justice, beauty, but they are not those things. The human being perhaps has material connotations to it, but all the same I have to wonder, because we are talking within the intelligible sphere here. So the human being is responsible for seeing all of this. He goes on and he says, separate from us and all those like us. Is there a form itself of human being, or fire, or water? Now, it's interesting, it's the reiteration. Is there a form of the human being? Is there a form of the human being? And then he gives another two qualities, or characteristics, this fire and water. What are we to say here, or what are we to think about what he's getting at? Now, it's possible he's saying that we're moving down in these categories, and fire and water are more simple, perhaps more material. They may have some symbolic significance, which we probably can't overlook as one potential meaning. But it becomes clear to us, not a moment later, that when Parmenides responds to this sort of hesitation, he says, what about the things that might seem absurd, like hair, mud, and dirt, or anything else totally undignified and worthless? I think that second term is important. The first term is important too for its own sake, but that worthlessness, that there is no value to it, that there seems to be no purpose, or perhaps that it's information that is stagnant and waiting for some orienting purpose. And so we may be entering into this complicated world for which certain ideas and concepts may be so mixed that it's difficult to identify where the form of that thing is. Because certainly we can find a form that hair, mud, dirt, things that are undignified that participate in, and there could be so many of them that they become these sorts of things. Like dirt is seemingly the poster child for a mixture of that which is difficult to identify, that which is common. And Parmenides asks the important question: are you doubtful whether or not you should say that a form is separate for each of these two, which in turn is other than anything we touch with our hands? And to this, Socrates makes an important distinction. He says, not at all. So you'll have to forgive me, but we have a visitor, and that is what that sound is in the microphone, a purring visitor. So, considering this path that we are on, now questioning Socrates about the absurd, potentially, or the potentially absurd of things that participate in forms, that have forms in and of themselves, that are quite unique to that thing, and not just diffuse into some mixture, for which the mixture is the thing that pulls from so many forms. It's difficult to understand exactly what form is good in that situation. And so Socrates says no in a sense. So he says no, so he says not at all. On the contrary, these things are in fact just what we see. So what has he established here? He is sort of rebuking the idea from Parmenides that all of these forms are totally separate, which in turn is other than anything we touch with our hands. And since there are potentially, given the question, there are all of these, the multiplicity of forms that are present, is it then true that there is this intelligible sphere for every single one of these things? And of course it at one instance gets to the heart of this plurality problem, because if we multiply this out infinitely, then there would be the most minute forms for the most minute of things. And while I suppose it's possible to analyze things in that way and still use the framework, it becomes impractical. But Socrates says, on the contrary, these things are in fact just what we see. So there's an implication that, of course, there's a relationship between the forms and the intelligible sphere. And although what we see is maybe not a perfect form, we see the things that participate in these forms, in the intelligible landscape. We are the seers of the intelligible landscape, expressed in mixture. But ultimately this mixture has some coherence, some identity to it. Surely, it's too outlandish to think there is a form for them. Okay, so here's our next step. Now, initially I read that and interpreted that as, surely it's not too outlandish to think there is a form for them. So on the one hand, I made the suggestion earlier that, well, it's potential that these forms scale all the way down, or they stop at a certain point, and these forms take on a level of sophistication, and that's not a good marker or a good definition. It has to be more something purpose related, or its purpose as it relates to the broader oneness, the broader identity. He says, surely it's too outlandish to think there is a form for them. Not that the thought that the same thing might hold in all cases hasn't troubled me from time to time. So we've made kind of a jump here in thought. So he is of the opinion that of the whatever characteristic that we can identify, of the things that seem either to be so mixed, so simple, or so base, in the productive sense, like base material, like a tree that has been cut down and now has been turned into treated wood, for example. We could talk about the structure that was before, and then it transformed into something that is now more basic potential, waiting to participate in almost like the purgatory of forms, waiting to participate in some broader system or structure. Surely it's too outlandish to think there is a form for them. Not that the thought of the same thing might hold in all cases hasn't troubled me from time to time. Now, there can be many things that can be meant here, I think. If one is to be troubled about one thing that holds all things, there's different errors that can be expressed that way, or through that mode of thinking. And there are certain positives, I think, too. And it's hard to say that if we find the positive within that, then that's enough for us. We stop our philosophical inquiry. I don't think it quite works that way. I think there's sort of a constant build to this sort of framework and structure of seeing. However, let's try to place ourselves in Socrates' shoes. So he's so convinced, perhaps, that when he considers a thought, that the same thing might hold in all cases. So it's either he's troubled by his own thought, that the forms are restricted to a certain domain, or rather, a certain level for which other things participate in, or he is thinking that because there is this multiplicitous participation, that there might be something actually that he doesn't see, maybe that the forms are integrated in whatever the case might be. He says, then, when I got bogged down in that, I hurry away, afraid that I may fall into some pit of nonsense and come to harm. So I think that the part that I said about his anxiety about being incorrect is true here. This is where Parmenides points out his youth. And so he runs away from the problem at hand, even though it's an important one. But when I arrive back in the vicinity of things we agreed a moment ago have forms, I linger there and occupy myself with them. So he's comfortable enough saying that, arriving back in the vicinity of the things we agreed a moment ago have forms. So of the thing, he's saying of things, there are forms. There are these forms. He wants to hold on to that. But then he agrees that of things that are, they don't have maybe a specific form or a form similar enough in likeness that it's worth one of these things for everything. This is when Parmenides says, that's because you are still young, Socrates. And philosophy has not yet gripped you as, in my opinion, it will in the future, once you begin to consider none of these cases beneath your notice. Now, though, you still care about what people think, because of your youth. Now, Parmenides restates Socrates' place about where he's at, and I think this is a beautiful conversation tactic, in the sense that when one wishes to farther engage, it's not to further belabor the point that Socrates is youthful and he's running away from this thing. It's to go back to what he knows, where he has this philosophical genius, yet still thriving, moving away from the inconsistency of mind that that makes it passive, that makes it run away. So it is, in a sense, focusing on that which is good. He says, is it your view that, as you say, there are certain forms from which these other things, by getting a share of them, derive their names, as, for instance, they come to be like by getting a share of likeness, large by getting a share of largeness, and just and beautiful by getting a share of justice and beauty? And so far it seems like a fairly consistent reinterpretation, a restatement of Socrates' claim, and it keeps us a bit safe from which we have a new vantage point where we can spring off again. So to reiterate, these forms, they are these purity-like intelligible structures, and there are things that are somewhat separate, but they are separate because they are mixed. They utilize this intelligible sphere, but because they are born of a mixed environment, the purity and the unity of things is, at least at the human level, not seen immediately. He is able to see it, he has the capacity to see it, but by his embodied expression and multiplicitous way of things, perhaps, he is subject to a type of falsehood, but also he's subject to an experience that makes his experience dynamic. So this is an interesting quality of reality, let's say, I think. So these other things, we need a better word to describe what these other things are, and I think we just went over that. The other things are those that are not purely forms. They are mixed. Again, I don't want to say that within the intelligible landscape that material things don't exist, because of course they do. This is not really the purpose of this. Whether or not they're material is almost inconsequential. The fact of the matter is, does the thing participate in a broader form when it has so much multiplicity in it? When we die, I think we participate in less of the form of the human being than when we are alive. Now, there still is a strong participation of the body without conscious experience. But we understand that this is not the full experience of the human being, and so it's even farther away from the form than even a standard human being is from the form of man. Now, the other part of this, and I'll read briefly again. There are certain forms from which these other things, by getting their share of them, derive their names. So the name is an important thing, because if the purity is to give a name to something, that means that thing is held within the form. That is its unifying principle. So if man is to be our form, then that form is the thing that gives us our name. So there's an intelligible landscape, an intelligible rule book, let's say, for which mankind belongs to. Now to this, Socrates replies, it certainly is. So that brings us to our next page, which I'll read now. So does each thing that gets a share get as its share the form as a whole or a part of it? Or could there be some other means of getting a share apart from these two? How could there be, he said. Do you think, then, that the form as a whole, one thing, is in each of the many? Or what do you think? What's to prevent it from being one, Parmenides, said Socrates. So, being one and the same, it will be at the same time as the whole in things that are many and separate, and thus it would be separate from itself. No, it wouldn't, says Socrates. Not if it's like one and the same day. that is in many places at the same time, and is none the less not separate from itself. If it's like that, each of the forms might be, at the same time, one and the same in all. Socrates says, "How neatly you make one and the same thing be in many places at the same time. It's as if you were to cover many people with a sail, and then say that one thing as a whole is over many. Or isn't that sort of thing you mean to say?" "Perhaps," he replied. "In that case, would the sail be, as a whole, over each person, or would a part of it be over one person and another part over another?" "A part. So the forms themselves are divisible, Socrates," he said. "And these that partake of them would partake of a part. No longer would a whole form, but only a part of it, be in each thing." "It does appear that way. Then are you willing to say, Socrates, that our one form is really divided? Will it still be one?" "Not at all," he replied. "No," said Parmenides, "for suppose you are going to divide largeness itself. If each of the many large things is to be large by a part of largeness smaller than largeness itself, won't that appear unreasonable?" "It certainly will," he replied. "What about this? Will each thing that has received a small part of the equal have something by which to be equal to anything, when its portion is less than the equal itself?" "That's impossible." "Well, suppose one of us is going to have a part of the small. The small will be larger than that part of it, since the part is a part of it. So the small itself will be larger. And that to which the part subtracted is added will be smaller, not larger, than it was before." "That surely couldn't happen," he said. So today happens to be a new day, and like always, a new day brings new thoughts. We happen to have a visitor here that I'm pacifying by petting, and so hopefully he doesn't disturb the microphone because his face is quite close to it, and he started purring, so there's that. So where to begin? Well, we're going to begin at the top of the page. So we're expanding on our idea, or of Socrates' idea, of the form as part of this intelligible landscape that is providing parts of itself, or itself, this is the question that we're going to get into, to all of the things that are. And there are an incredible number of things that are, that involve a mixture of things. And so part of understanding what the form is understanding the relationship between how it comes down. And so we have this sort of vertical, it would seem, or horizontal, vertical, I suppose, if I'm saying coming down, for which we can explore. Again, we have material substrate, and then we have intelligible matter as understood by conscious experience and self-awareness. But you see that word intelligible matter, it's not good enough to describe it. I'm so steeped in this material culture that sometimes it's hard to see out of it, and even, I suppose it's natural because it's my landscape. It's the landscape that I find myself living in and through. And it makes sense to compare things based on the various mixture of all of nature. And thinking about things that are so separate. But of course, as we know at this point, maybe I should clarify that what we are at least attempting to do is to resolve the relationship of difference between that of the intelligible and that of the base material. And so maybe I should be careful not to go too far into a place where I don't feel comfortable. And going back again to what Parmenides is saying, he speaks asking Socrates about the potential for a form to give all of itself or part of itself to that base material, whatever it is, giving it purpose and direction. Again, is it part or is it whole? Or could there be some other means of getting a share apart from these two? And Socrates says, how could there be? And Parmenides says, do you think then that the form as a whole, one thing, is in each of the many? Or what do you think? So let's think about how to respond to this. The form as a whole, one thing, is in each of the many. So in some sense we have to draw back again the idea of the form and draw it out, I think, a little bit more detailed. So right now I've been referring to the form as an intelligible item, almost like an item that we are familiar with in our experience. It's something that is afforded by our experience. But the form is something that is more. In some sense, we're limited by the structural framework that is the form. But that's just the point. It's a structural framework nonetheless. We need one. We can build on it as we go. The form has information within it, surely. I've been calling this the intelligible landscape or the intelligible sphere. I think an equivalent potentially could be a spiritual world, a spiritual domain. I don't want to say dimension, because it's measured in experience, and it's hard to measure experience. Or we could say it's measured in vision, it's measured in seeing, existing, being. Form is something of a structured principle that makes a thing what it is. It's not a rigid mold. Perhaps it can be thought of as an intelligible contour, defining the lines of that which is knowable. Here I think about the creative process, I think of Genesis. I think of our role in that picture. A principle of unity, a rule of organization, a logic of being. The logic of being is an interesting one. In the divine sense, of course, we have our movers, our agentic, I don't know if we would call them forms, but agentic, they're gods. Now, to expand on this idea of the intelligible landscape, so I don't just keep using this word as a cop-out, by intelligible landscape, what I mean is the structured field of intelligible principles. Now, it expands it. It really doesn't tell us exactly what it is, but it gets us a little bit closer, I think, because at least I think we can identify important principles. This business about mixture, about a form for each little minute thing, there's a lot of layering in that, and I'm not really sure how to approach that just yet. Another thing perhaps that we can consider when we think about the intelligible landscape is it is the domain of what can be known in itself. And so what do we necessarily have? A domain of what can be known in itself. We have a what we were speaking of earlier in our first reflections and expansion on the form is that it is something that gives a sense of purity, stability, structure. It is the place or the where of meaning, but without being a place. Again, the intelligible landscape. But we can't, and we should not, if we are going to have any adequate form and reasonable form, definition of the form, we have to avoid physical measuring, I guess. The dimension is what I'm getting at. So we have to avoid the place, we have to avoid the dimension, we have to avoid on the spiritual side the up there. And we have to avoid a spiritual geography, because that's not what we're after at this point. Now, if we speak of, as I spoke of earlier, the spiritual world or domain, there's a way in which just a moment ago I denied that this is what we're dealing with. We're not necessarily dealing with the divine right now. We're not speaking about agentic causes. We're just thinking about the forms, very basic materials of that domain. And so again, this precludes disembodied spirits, angelic beings, gods, some place that a soul can travel to, some dimension that's layered over ours. It's not to say that spiritual terms and spiritual observations are not true. I mean to say that where we are is at the structural level. We speak of how it is possible for something to be. Agency may be an important part of it, but we are talking about even more basic components. In time, I think once we blend together or understand how the relationship exists more appropriately between that which is one and that which is many, then we could begin to discuss these higher level things. But we're at a more basic level for now. So we've done our definition of the form. We've expanded it at least a little bit. So where does that leave us now? So again, the question, do you think then that the form as a whole, one thing, is in each of the many? Or what do you think? Now, each of the many is all things. But it can also be the many in terms of more than just one. So it breaks the unity, breaks the oneness. We can take them both, I suppose. But I think they likely mean the latter. But taking the first, I suppose, to begin with. The one participating in the many. There would be a purity of the one that is within the mixture, that is the many. And by, depending on how it, again, we're thinking about a structure, so depending on how much it is turned up, let's say, in the world, like we can imagine a water spigot, and this water contains information particular to that thing, whereas what it's flowing into is more water, but of information of different sorts of things. And so we can find, just as we can find in our water, traces of imperfections, or things that would be potentially dangerous to us. And just the same, we can't see it as we're talking about it now. But I think also we think about an established principle in this way, as the spigot being turned on versus turned off or reduced. And we can think about the volume of the place that it flows into. Is there more of that or less of that? I think the more of it that there is in there, there would be more of it expressed. Now, if we explain that, we explained the other potential consequence. So again, do you think then that the form as a whole, one thing, is in each of the many? Socrates responds, he says, "What's to prevent its being one?" He says, so being one and the same, it will be at the same time as a whole in things that are many and separate, and thus it would be separate from itself. So we arrive at a new question. How does it retain itself if it is within the many? And I think maybe they're speaking specifically of a principle, maybe a principle of being, for example. So today again happens to be a new day, and I'm joined again by my cat, who is laying on the table that I'm recording this on, and hopefully it does not interfere with the task at hand. So we didn't make it too far last time, though we did make some good headway on defining the form. I'd like to continue in this vein. Do you think, then, that the form as a whole, one thing, is in each of the many, or what do you think? What's to prevent its being one, Parmenides, says Socrates. So being one and the same, it will be at the same time as a whole in things that are many and separate, and thus it would be separate from itself. It's interesting how the mind works, because we all have our ideas and understandings of things, our perspectives. And so when I see this, I see, as we described yesterday, the way in which the forms come down, the way in which the mixture of material things participate in this structured principles of these forms. And these forms, as we've established, do not give their purity as the wholeness of their being would suggest, when they are necessarily diluted by other things, or diluted. Now, this dilution, I wouldn't want to necessarily say it's a bad thing, because within mixture there are affordances. Surely we are an example of that affordance that this conscious experience is. But with regard to the form, the identity of the form, it seems quite obvious that the purity of the thing cannot be maintained. But the purity of it, I don't necessarily think would have to do with the whole of it. And so, much like if we say that there is a liquid, for example, many liquids contain water, we can say that there's water in vodka. But just because 100% of water is not within this vodka doesn't mean that there is no water in the vodka, and it doesn't mean that we should, for whatever reason, begin calling this vodka water. Its identity is formed based on its relative composition. And there's a participation of these factors. Now in response, Socrates says, no, it wouldn't. Not if it's like one and the same day. That is in many places at the same time, and is nonetheless not separate from itself. So this part, in some sense, is where we've been before. That is to say, there's a transcendence of dimension, and the particular dimension in this case is, what would we say, location, place. Again, to reiterate that the form is ubiquitous. It's all over. The sun doesn't discriminate during the day. It's everywhere. And I think also that we can extend this out into all other dimensions. It's not really a structure that requires these dimensions in order for it to be, or for it to be used, for example. If it's like that, each of the forms might be, at the same time, one and the same in all. Socrates, he said, how neatly you make one and the same thing be in many places at the same time, is as if you were trying to cover many people with a sail, and then say that one thing as a whole is over many. Or isn't that sort of thing you mean to say? So again, we're operating under the idea that this is dimension independent. So the place is irrelevant. Just thinking about how I would use this, Socrates' argument so far as a rebuttal to Parmenides. So covering many people with a sail, not sure what that means exactly. But I suppose it means that the sail is this external object covering these many people, as a form would be in many things. But it's only a part of the sail that covers the individuals. But here I still wonder at the argument, because the purpose of the form, the purpose of the sail, is still participating even in what Parmenides is saying, in the space of material relations, that of place, it is just one segment. But again, we're not dealing with these parameters. This is a structure of intelligibility, of the intelligible arena. As I wanted to say sphere, but then again there are sort of dimensional indications. There's still dimensional indications when I say arena. But an arena is more of a purposeful thing rather than a sphere. But a sphere, I suppose, could just indicate the intellectual area for which the structure is participating. And again, I have to make the obligatory statement that material reality is not separate from this formal structure. It's just that the causes of material relations participate in this mixed environment. This mixed environment of physical causes and the like have also formal consequences, and their interrelations are complex. But their complexity is not a direct mirror, for example. Material causes has plenty of complex relations. Formal instruction, formal innervation maybe, also has very, very complex mixtures and interactions. But these are two ways of seeing that in this language are kept separate. Now, rather keenly, or perhaps rather slyly, Socrates responds, perhaps. In that case, would the sale be as a whole over each person, or would a part of it be over one person, and another part over another? A part, says Socrates. So here, the logical place to go for Parmenides would be to say, aha, well, you've said that. Well, how can it be possible then for this unification of the form to exist when you say that only a part of it participates in its productive interactions with those that it covers? So the forms themselves are divisible, Socrates, he said, and things that partake of them would partake of a part. No longer would a whole form, but only a part of it, be in each thing. It does appear that way, he says. Then are you willing to say, Socrates, that our one form is really divided? Will it still be one? Not at all, he replied. No, said Parmenides. For suppose you are going to divide largeness itself. If each of the many large things is to be large by a part of largeness, smaller than largeness itself, won't that appear unreasonable? Certainly it will, he replied. What about this? Will each thing that has received a small part of the equal of have something by which to be equal to anything, when its portion is less than the equal itself? This seems to me, perhaps I'm being unkind and lazy in my reading and estimation, but I still maintain that we have to be a little bit more careful about where we find the forms, or how we find their expression, and perhaps I'm mistaken here, and perhaps I'm ignoring some rule that they are navigating that I am disobeying. But for my part, when I imagine this equal as a form, and as it participates in something, when it is expressed in something, that it doesn't necessarily mean that all things, because equal is within it, is submitted to it. It would be true if it was a purity, if it was the form itself, but it is the form, but only expressed given a certain relationship. And so, if this is to be the case, well, what does that mean? That means that the relationship has, and the orientation has a degree to do with preserving the unity of the form that may otherwise seem partially to exist within any particular thing. And that happened to be my cat smelling the microphone. So Socrates responds, that's impossible. Well, suppose one of us is going to have a part of the small. The small will be larger than that part of it. Since the part is a part of it, so the small itself will be larger. And that to which the part subtracted is added will be smaller, not larger, than it was before. So the first statement here, well, I guess the second technically, but the small will be larger than that part of it. So I think this is an important point for me to understand. So we are saying that we have a part of the small, And in my grammar, the part that I share in the small would activate relationally. So I don't share in the relation. I am not bounded within the unity of the form of the small by my relation to my cat, because I am much larger than my cat, and my cat is much smaller than I am. But my cat is bound by the unification of the form of smallness in relation to me, because he is smaller than I am. The small will be larger than that part of it. So a rather confusing statement. He says, the small will be larger than that part of it, since the part is a part of it. So in the sense that Parmenides is talking about the form of the small being larger than the part of it that the thing participates in, I think what we're speaking about here is fullness rather than dimensionality, because again, he mentioned location before, but now he's mentioning size, and the structure of the forms are independent of these dimensions. And so I think that this is where the discrepancy is. So the small itself will be larger, and that to which the part subtracted is added will be smaller, not larger, than it was before. Socrates says that surely couldn't happen. And so I think I'm going to leave this episode here and continue next time with part 2 of Parmenides.